Hello, I'm Toby Skerritt from Foundation IT, and I'm here today to talk to you about Azure-based remote desktop services implementations versus the newer Azure Virtual Desktop solution. Now, many organizations have deployed remote desktop services either on-premise or in Azure, um, and the process is fairly similar for Azure versus an on-premise deployment. Azure requires organizations to set up their own infrastructure, and the model is a bring your own licensing model. So in a RDS deployment in Azure, you would need to supply user client access licenses or subscriber access licenses. So those would need to be purchased from Microsoft and applied to your licensing server in the environment. You're required to build and manage the required infrastructure components yourself, and that includes the broker, web access gateway, licensing server, SQL in database environment, and the session hosts. So here's a high-level architectural overview of what an RDSH remote desktop session host architecture would look like within an Azure environment. This is taken from Microsoft. And you can see that within that environment, we have an Azure virtual network, off which hang our Active Directory domain controllers, an Azure SQL database, file servers for our user profile disks, so that's for profile management, and our remote desktop session hosts, which would allow multiple users to connect to a single desktop host. Externally to this, we would have our connection brokers, our licensing server, our gateway, and our web access layer, and potentially load balancers over the top of that. All of those components would need to be configured by the organization implementing RDS, and then users would access this environment over the public internet. Now, these servers would still be connected to your, potentially could be connected to your backend domain, so users would have access to all of the services associated with that. AVD is quite different. Azure Virtual Desktop is based upon the Microsoft 365 licensing model, and within the environment, you're only required to build and manage the session hosts. The management layer, so all of the gateway elements, the licensing server, etc., are provided as a service by Microsoft at no additional cost. It's included in the M365 licensing cost. And you can see that that translates to a much simpler architectural layout for the environment. So within our Azure environment and attached to our virtual network, we have Active Directory, which is a recommendation. Obviously, you can connect to an on-premise one, but it's always useful to have a local Active Directory for these session host servers to connect to. We have an Azure Files instance, which is where our FS Logics profile management would be located, and user profiles. And we have our AVD session hosts, which would be Windows 10 multi-session most likely. Those are connected to via the public internet. And the management plane, the broker, gateway, licensing, load balancing, all of the elements that you would need to manage yourself as part of an RDS deployment are provided as a service by Microsoft. From a cost perspective, and thanks to Nerdio, our partner, for this very useful table, we can see that costs are significantly reduced in an AVD environment as compared to an RDS deployment, mainly via the removal of the cost for the management plane. You can see that the box at the bottom, it's $2.50 per user for hundreds of users and higher for smaller deployments. So that's per user per month, an additional cost that would have to be paid, which is covered in your Microsoft 365 licensing for AVD. Note as well that this table excludes virtual machine resource costs. These would likely be very similar in both deployments, but they're not included, and they will likely be the highest cost in any deployment. In summary then, AVD is significantly less complex to deploy and manage, as we don't have the requirement for those infrastructure servers. RDS can be easily migrated to AVD. If you have an RDS deployment in place, then you essentially have all of the components, or certainly the vast majority of the components, that will be required to service Azure Virtual Desktop environment. And AVD costs could be significantly lower as no infrastructure servers are required. The biggest cost in Azure is to run compute services such as servers themselves. Now, when we have a resilient RDS deployment with multiple connection brokers, licensing servers, gateways, etc., the cost to run those servers are quite high, and you need to factor that into the per user cost. Those aren't required as part of an AVD deployment. All of those costs are bundled into your Microsoft 365 licensing. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this video has been useful. Thank you.